Hi, Catherine from Omaha. And Lindsay from Cedar Hill ISD. And welcome, Irene from San Antonio. So glad to have you join us today. Welcome, Jennifer from Richmond. Glad you could join us today. Welcome, Bianca. Bianca's from Port Lavaca. Welcome, Latoya from Cedar Hill and Michelle from Dallas. Glad you could join us today.
So Stephanie, I'm going to need a little assistance from you because I tried to start the live stream and it kicked me out of the webinar. It says it's live streaming, but I don't know that that's true. So let me double check.
We appear to be live streaming. I'm trying to verify that the captioner has been assigned. I'm having issues with that.
Showing live streaming, but is it really?
Yeah, it is. So, okay. Cool. It was just really weird because I started the live stream. I came back here and it kicked me all the way out of the webinar. I'm like, okay.
Good. I'm glad that's working.
Cool. And I made you, when I came in, it put me as host. So I moved it back to you, Steph.
Okay.
I don't have the permissions on my end to assign the captioner. And
so we may need to make us co-host because I see that's been dropped when I came back in and made her host.
I apologize for all the technical difficulties, everyone. We're a new system and Zoom has gone through some updates over the course of the holidays. So we're
Absolutely. Okay, I've got you, Chelsea and Christina both as co-hosts.
okay.
And then do we just promote the closed captioner as a panelist? Is that what we're doing?
Yes. And then it should allow us to assign them to closed captioning. At least that's what we did last time, but even as co-host, I don't have any of the closed caption settings available on my bar down here. So
I've sent it, but I don't know that it's working.
well, they are still here. I will send them a message. Give me just a second. Did you get the message from Christina?
Yes, I saw something come across.
She has lost power, so.
All right, we've got our closed captioner set up, so perfect. It's still showing live streaming. It may just be connected. It looks like it's still streaming, so I think we're good on that. So we've got it on Facebook. We've got everything going. All right, and I see that we're at 12:15. So we're going to go ahead and get started, everyone. Welcome again, and thank you all for joining us today. We apologize for technical difficulties as we are navigating changes that Zoom has made. It looks like everything is working and we're good to go. We've got closed captioning set up for all of you. So if you need that, it is available. So welcome. Let me take a minute to introduce myself and our team at Partners Resource Network. So Partners Resource, my name is Stephanie McLaughlin, and I am the Training and Evaluation Specialist with Partners Resource Network. Partners Resource Network is the nonprofit agency that operates the Texas statewide network of parent training and information centers, or PTIs. PTIs are funded through the Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs. There are 4 PTI projects across Texas known as PACT, PATH, PIN, and TEAM. And our mission is to empower and support Texas families and individuals impacted by disabilities or special health care needs. Joining us today with Partners Resource Network is our support specialist, Chelsea Rivas, and our technology specialist, Zach Hidalgo. Our director of statewide services, Christina, is having some issues, but she will be joining us later on. If you are having any technical difficulties today, please reach out in the chat box to Zach, and he will assist you with those. And for those of you that are needing a certificate of attendance, you will be receiving an email today to thank you for attending the webinar. If you'll follow the link in that email, you can get your own certificate of attendance. We will also be having a question and answer time at the end of the presentation today. If you're joining us on Zoom, please put your questions in the Q&A box. If you're joining us on Facebook, you can put your questions in the comments and we'll get them there. We are also recording today's webinar, and the recording will be available on our website at prntexas.org. All right. So let me go ahead and introduce our speaker, and we're going to turn it over to him so he can have as much time as possible. So today our speaker is Stephen Aleman. Prior to joining Disability Rights Texas, Stephen had many years of experience in policy analysis, law, mediation, and teaching. He has worked both in Washington, D.C. at the federal level and in Austin, Texas at the state level. Drawing on this broad range of experience encompassing education policy analysis and disability law, Stephen now serves as a senior policy specialist at Disability Rights Texas, managing policy advocacy affecting children, youth, and adults with disabilities in the Texas public school system. Stephen, welcome. I'm going to stop sharing this PowerPoint and I'm going to share yours, and we'll get you all set up and let you get started.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunities to participate today. And as soon as we get my PowerPoint slides up, we'll get started.
Right, we should have that good to go, Stephen.
Very good. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. Great. So as you all know, and why you're here, we're here to talk about the new legislative session that is just about a week old at this point. And in today's presentation, I'm going to do 3 basic things. I'm just going to give some background information to set the stage for consideration of legislation affecting students with disabilities. And then I'm going to get into why we're all here to talk about bills that have already been filed, to give a sense of what topics might be addressed this legislative session. And then finally, we'll conclude with hopefully a little bit of time for folks who might want to put a question into the Q&A function. And we will otherwise get started with our next slide. Now, I'm going to actually start by taking a look back. If we can move to the next slide, Stephanie, when you're ready. Here we go. Great. So to set the stage, really set the stage for this conversation about the 88th legislature, I want to start by talking about the 87th legislature, which met 2 years ago in 2021. Of course, we were in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic at that time. I think everyone always believes that each legislative session is unique. This one was profoundly unique, given that we don't have a pandemic, thank goodness. every time the legislature happens. It was a challenge just to participate in the process. But nonetheless, some legislative activity did occur. And Stephanie, if you could regain my PowerPoint slide and then go ahead and go to the next slide, please. It looks like we're having a little bit of technical difficulties right now. No worries, but we'll get right back on track. If we could
I
go.
think we got that. Apologize. We've got it up again and we'll go on to that next slide.
Yes, yes. And I'm not gonna talk too much about what happened in the past, because we are all here interested in what's about to happen. But just to set the stage again, to remind you that the legislature does take an interest in students with disabilities and special education services. Every session, there are a good number of bills that are passed connected to students with disabilities and special ed. And just to highlight a few of these today, I want to point out House Bill 1252, which was a very significant bill that affected special education due process hearings and the amount of time a parent, or for that matter, a school district can bring a request for a due process hearing. What we call the statute of limitations was increased from 1 year to 2 years. And that's a pretty substantial procedural change in our special education procedural safeguards here in Texas. Texas has the ability to change that time period, and it had been at 1 year for decades. And so to get a bill passed that made that kind of change is very significant. Just to illustrate as well what can happen during a legislative session, Senate Bill 89 was passed, again, keeping in mind that pandemic at that point, asking that every ARD committee take a look at their students and consider what compensatory services might be needed for that student to make up lost services while schools were closed. And so again, the legislature can pass any number of measures affecting special education, and often, in fact, does do so. So just a couple other highlights from last time. The legislators met in Austin. We'll go to slide 6, I believe it is. And so to just wrap up here, we have some more examples here on the screen of some other bills. House Bill 159 by Representative Gonzalez is more of a long-term bill to improve staff training and development for professionals coming into the field. And connected to that was a much more focused bill, House Bill 2256, again, a long-term bill which requires our State Board for Educator Certification to create a new bilingual special education teacher certificate. And just as an example of how this process works, well, that bill did pass 2 years ago, House Bill 2256, on the new special education bilingual certification. It does not yet exist in Texas. SBEC, the State Board for Educator Certification, is still working on it. So sometimes some of these bills take immediate effect and there are changes in practices as of now. Sometimes these bills pass and it takes time for them to really develop. But this is just to give you a flavor for what happens in a legislative session affecting special education. And I'm not going to belabor the rest of these bills in the interest of time. So Stephanie, we can go ahead and advance. And we can go to slide, we can keep going past these and go to the next one right here. We'll stop here then. So what happened between 2021 and 2023? We call this period in Texas the legislative interim. Again, for those of you who may be new to Texas, our state lawmakers only meet for 6 months every other year in the regular session. Now, last legislative session was a good illustration of what can happen beyond the regular session. That is what runs from January to May. In 2021, we had a host of special sessions where lawmakers were here in town almost the whole rest of the year. But those extra periods of legislative sessions we call special sessions, and they only can occur when the governor says so. And they can only address topics that the governor says that state lawmakers can address. So it's a very interesting system we have here in Texas, where the executive branch can tell the legislative branch to some degree what they can and cannot do. But generally speaking, most legislative sessions just include the regular session, and then there's nothing that happens beyond that. Then that brings us to those even number years, such as 2022, that we have at the Capitol where there are still things happening. And we call that the interim. And that is typically a time when committees still meet, still hold hearings, and address topics that are ongoing, that are emerging, and they know that the next regular session will need to address. So we'll go to the next slide then. So in 2022, during the 87th legislature interim session, in the Senate, I have to say there was really not much happening in regard to public education overall. There was only one interim hearing in the Senate, and during that interim hearing, there was no specific direct focus on special education and students with disabilities. However, over on the House side, the House Public Education Committee was much busier. They held several interim hearings, and there was one particular hearing focused on a special education issue. There was a legislative oversight hearing on Senate Bill 1716 on something called the Supplemental Special Ed Services Program, or SSES program for short. And the committee went forward to include in its interim report to the 88th legislature 3 specific recommendations to make improvements in the SSES program for students with disabilities. So this is an example of how, while the regular session is not happening, there is no direct activity on the floor to pass bills or debate bills. Nonetheless, state lawmakers can be busy and making decisions and thinking through issues affecting students with disabilities. And the House Public Education Committee interim report recommendations on the SSES program is one illustration of that, that helps build and sets the stage for what will happen this year in the regular session. Next slide, please. Now, it's very important to point out that in the buildup to the legislative session, it's not just that interim committee hearings are happening. Across state government, there are many state advisory committees. These are official committees generally authorized in state law, although to some degree state agencies have the own discretion and power to create their own advisory committees. But these advisory committees are very important. They are typically committees comprised of appointees by the governor, although sometimes an agency head has the leeway to also name individuals to participate. But these statewide advisory committees, like the rest of us, are keeping the pulse on what's happening in the field in special education, for instance, and talking about those issues. And one of the nice things about these advisory committees is that aside from being at the state capitol, these are other forums where we can address ongoing issues and talk about solutions. And so I want to point out in particular that going into the 88th legislature, there were 3 particular advisory committees I want to highlight. One is a temporary committee that was formed based on legislation passed in 2021. That was the Texas Commission on Special Education Funding. The Texas Commission on Special Education Funding, as the name suggests, was focused on our state finance system to support special ed services in public schools. When you may have just noticed that in the chat, there was a message to you all saying that my presentation will be available later on, posted on the PRN website. When you get access to that material to review later in detail, the material I'm summarizing today, hopefully you'll be able to see that there are embedded in that presentation hyperlinks. But in any event, any of this material I'm covering, it's very easy to just simply put in bill numbers and Google that, or the name of an advisory committee and Google that and get their final report. But in the final report, the Texas Commission on Special Education Funding, they made 14 specific recommendations to improve the state system of financial support for special education services. So this is very significant because undoubtedly some of these 14 ideas are going to translate into bills. And so it's important to be aware that of the commission, be aware of its report and the ideas they've introduced, because that's a good signal of legislation that may be coming up this year. Those recommendations, by the way, by the Commission on Special Ed Funding were really divided into two areas. One specific on the allocation formula for special ed services, and I'm going to talk about that here in a bit more when we talk about specific bills, but also talked about specific grant programs, some of which would be permanent, some of which would be temporary, to further provide financial resources to schools to educate students with disabilities. Another important advisory committee that met in 2022 is the Special Education Continuing Advisory Committee. It is hosted by the Texas Education Agency, but all of its members are appointed by the governor. And that committee just released its report to the legislature. And in that report, there were 32 recommendations in 9 areas connected to students with disabilities and special education. So they were really brainstorming quite a bit to come up with 32 recommendations for Texas lawmakers. Again, this is an important report to review, to see their ideas and see how many of those may be translated into bills in this new session. And then finally, I'll point out in terms of setting the stage for the 88th legislature and ideas to be brought forward for lawmakers is another advisory group called the Governor's Committee on People with Disabilities. The Governor's Committee on People with Disabilities is a very high-level committee about all topics affecting people with disabilities, as opposed to the 2 previous ones I just mentioned, which were very specific on public education and students with disabilities. The Governor's Committee has a very wide charge and mandate, but they did focus on some special ed issues in 2022 and took several votes to endorse reform proposals connected to special education. Now, as far as I'm aware, their report has not yet been made public. And so I don't have a specific report to reference, but I was monitoring their public meetings last year, and I know they took several votes on special ed issues in terms of policy recommendations. And so again, that's another body to follow and to track what are they saying to state lawmakers about what needs to be done. So all that to be said, there is a lot on the table coming into the legislative session. So let's talk a little bit more about the 88th legislature now. Next slide, please. And let's talk about really where the action will happen. First of all, let's start in the Senate. Some of you who may have been involved in the past in terms of following legislation will know that Senator Larry Taylor was the chair of the Senate Education Committee for a couple of sessions. He has now retired, and he will, so therefore the gavel will be passing to someone new in the 88th legislature. Now, last year during the interim, Senator Creighton took over the Education Committee from Senator Taylor. And while it's not official, I think that the expectation is that Senator Creighton will become the new chair of the Education Committee in the 88th Legislature. But like all committees, we are waiting on the announcement by the Lieutenant Governor, who is in charge of naming senators to committees, including who's in charge of those committees. We're waiting for the Lieutenant Governor to make that announcement or make it public. So we don't know yet who will be in charge of the Education Committee, but suffice it to say, the bets are on Senator Creighton to take the gavel in that committee. Now, likewise in the House, next slide, please. We are officially waiting for names of committee members. Now, a week ago, the House of Representatives met for the first time in the new 88th Legislature, and they reelected Speaker Phelan for a second term as Speaker of the House. Again, for those of you who aren't quite acquainted with Texas state government and the legislative branch, the House of Representatives picks the Speaker, the presiding officer for the Texas House of Representatives. And that happened a week ago. And so now that Speaker Phelan is back in place, he will be naming soon, perhaps by the end of the month, the committee membership, including who will be chairs of those committees. Now, again, for those of you who are around 2 years ago, you'll remember that Representative Dutton was the new chair of the House Public Education Committee. We are awaiting word to see whether or not Chairman Dutton will return for the 88th Legislature to be in charge of that committee. So that's a to be determined at this point. But that's going to be the focal point for special education as well as all public education legislation. They will be going through the House Pub Ed Committee, the Senate Education Committee before going to the floor. And we'll be monitoring those committee meetings for hearings. And just because a bill gets a hearing doesn't necessarily mean it will advance. So the membership of these committees is essential to as gatekeepers to deciding what bills will be advancing in the 88th Legislature. Now, next slide. Okay, so let me give you a resource for those of you who are not familiar with it, to keep track of all of this information about legislation, both past and present. Texas Legislature Online is the official state website for the Texas Legislative Branch. That website is being put into the chat right now. Thank you, Stephanie, so that you can have access to it. But it is a must-have, if you will, in terms of a bookmark, if you're going to have any interest in what's happening at the Texas Capitol. The great thing about Texas Legislature Online is that it has all the versions of legislation. And when I say all the versions, it may or may not come as a surprise to you, but when a lawmaker says, I want to have a bill, it is possible for that bill to change versions many, many times through the course of the legislative process. There is an introduced version of the bill. There's a committee passed version of the bill. There is a floor version of the bill. There's the House version of the bill. There's the Senate version of the bill. There's the version signed by the governor. So the nice thing about TLO, the Texas Legislature Online website, is that you can see all the variations of the legislation, all the versions of the legislation, to see how it may have evolved over time. And undoubtedly, a bill gets revised in some form or fashion throughout that process. And so knowing which version is the most current version is super critical, because you would hate to go testify on a bill in the Senate and look at the House introduced version and it was completely changed on the House floor, for instance, and now you're not talking about the right bill. So the other nice thing about TLO is that you don't have to be there in person to have a feel for what lawmakers are talking about. All legislative hearings, well, I'll say almost all legislative hearings are video broadcast. And so as long as they are meeting in a room with a camera, there's going to be a live stream of that meeting 99% of the time. And you can go back and watch the video recording of it if you don't have the time and opportunity to watch it live. Now, there is some caveat to this. Occasionally, there are technical misfortunes that occur, and you cannot see what's happening in the committee room. And sometimes the recordings aren't, the best quality, although generally they're very good. Like you can tell what's being said and observe. It's something though that's a great advantage to all of us in Texas to have the video and audio access to most of what's happening at the Capitol. So take advantage of that. So let's go ahead and now go to the next slide. Now we come to the sort of fun part of the presentation. That was all of my introduction, background about what happened 2 years ago, what happened last year, setting the stage for what is going on now. And so let's get into legislation. Now, again, it may come as somewhat of a surprise to you that actually the 88th legislature in some regards already started about 2 months ago. On November 14th, 2022, state lawmakers could start beginning to submit bills for consideration. We call that pre-filing of legislation because the 88th legislature had not yet officially begun. But lawmakers could start turning in bills. And so that process, of course, ramps up once we get into the calendar year and we get closer and closer to the beginning of the legislative session, regular session. And so as of Friday, there were already over 1,300 bills filed in the Texas House. And as of Friday, there were already over 400 bills filed in the Texas Senate. So that's a pretty large mass of legislation. And we're only a week into the legislative session at this point, the regular session at this point. So, of course, my organization, like many organizations, is trying to keep track of all of these bills. But you can just imagine, given that volume already, over 1,700 unique bills, it's hard to know for sure what's in each and every one of them. And so I do want to just preface the remaining part of my program by saying that I've tried to be very diligent in identifying bills affecting special education and students with disabilities. But there are times when you may say, well, wait a minute, you didn't talk about this bill. I thought it had something to do with special ed. It's possible I just may have missed it. It's also somewhat of a judgment call. What is a special ed bill and what isn't? So suffice it to say, though, that I already have a list of almost 30 bills to go over with you today out of that 1,700 list. So let's get started. We'll go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to start in the House, and I'm going to start just in the order that they have been introduced and talk a little bit about each bill. And if you have questions, hopefully we'll have time at the end to address those questions. Again, whether you have questions just in general about my introduction and all that information or specific to any of these bills. So let's start with House Bill 133. This is a bill about restraint procedures in public schools, and specifically to ban and not allow schools to use a certain type of restraint known as a prone or supine restraint. And that is when the student is either face down or face up fully on the ground or the floor. This bill would outlaw that particular type of restraint in public schools. House Bill 140 has to do with co-navigation services for students who are deafblind. This would assist them to be better able to navigate their environment, whether that's in public school or in other settings. And this would create a state program to provide co-navigation services. Next slide. Another bill, House Bill 166, is a bill affecting a segment of special education students. These are adult students with disabilities. That is, they are age 18 or older, but still in public school, still receiving special ed services. This bill would create a process for the appointment of what is termed an educational representative. And essentially what this bill is about is sort of like creating a guardianship-like process for those adult students who have a disability so severe that they cannot exercise their transfer of rights in special education. As you may know, in special ed, once a student turns 18, their parents have no legal right to make decisions for that student because they're now an adult. And so we trust that that adult student, still presumably with the input of parents, will be the one making decisions, signing documents. Well, we all know that there are certain students with disabilities who don't have the capacity to effectively exercise their own legal rights, and their parents have not gone to court yet to get guardianship for that student. So this would, House Bill 166 would create sort of an interim process by which schools would appoint an educational representative within certain parameters just for special ed decision-making while the student with a disability remain in public school receiving special ed services. Next slide, please. House Bill 195 has to do with modifications in the student's IEP, Individualized Education Program, or the student Section 504 plan when it comes to emergency or disaster situations. And essentially, House Bill 195 calls for the consideration of special and necessary accommodations so that the student can be safe during an emergency or disaster situation. And so this would be a new duty. And what's somewhat unique about this bill, House Bill 195, is that it not only addresses students in special ed, that is under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, but it also addresses students who are under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, what we refer to as Section 504 students, as well as special ed students. Next slide, please. House Bill 272 is a broad bill making many changes across the Texas Education Code. And this bill would update special education terminology. And an example of this is, I think I just mentioned this, here in Texas, we have all these special ed acronyms and terms we use. And one particular term we use in Texas, the Admission Review and Dismissal, or ARD committee, ARD committee, is a Texas term. It's not used in other states really. And so what House Bill 272 would do is go in and change every mention of ARD committee and instead use the federal term IEP team, Individualized Education Program team. It would make a lot of just conforming changes in our state laws so that national terminology would be used as opposed to state terminology. House Bill 333 is about licensed specialist in school psychology, what we would call LSSPs for short, and it would create a school psychologist shortage task force to look at how do we bring in more of these professionals into public schools to make sure that we have adequate services available to students with disabilities. And this would be a study bill, so we wouldn't actually know what recommendations there are until the 89th legislature in 2025. The next bill is actually two bills. This is a bill which is known as the No Kids in Cuffs bill. No Kids in Cuffs is a bill that actually exists in both the House and the Senate. We call these companion bills because the text of the bill is exactly the same. It's just that there's a version in the Senate and a version in the House. The House version is 459 and the Senate version is 133. And in short, this bill would prohibit police officers from handcuffing any student who's 10 years of age or younger, except for in extreme situations. Generally, law enforcement could not use handcuffs on kids younger than 10 years of age in public schools, including students with disabilities. The next slide, please. House Bill 473 has to do with threat assessment. Now, you all may know that because of another tragic school shooting in Santa Fe, the legislature created many school safety measures or passed many school safety measures. One of those school safety measures was this new process called threat assessment. Threat assessment basically means school staff, a group of school staff come together when they're triggered or notified, and they take a look at a particular student to try to decide whether or not that student poses a safety threat, a physical threat to the school community. Now, House Bill 473 makes some changes to that threat assessment process by making sure that parents are better involved in that process so that they can understand what's going on with their student who might be subject to a threat assessment. House Bill 516 is a bill connected to data collection from school districts to the Texas Education Agency, or TEA. And in this bill, a wide range of different disciplinary as well as law enforcement actions would have to be reported by different student groups, including students with disabilities. So this would be sort of a data bill, if you will, connected to special education. Next slide. House Bill 557 is a bill that would create a new state educational expense reimbursement program. Now, the way, as I understand it, it would work is that parents would be selected to participate. I believe you would have to apply to be in this program. Then you would submit expenses for various costs for your student that are education related, and then you would get a reimbursement check from the state for those costs that you paid out of pocket. Now, this bill does specifically enumerate that fees for educational therapies and services for a child with a disability would qualify for reimbursement in this program. The next bill, House Bill 579, is actually a twofer bill because there's really two different topics addressed in this bill. One has to do with testing, and the other has to do with state accountability. And that's okay. You can put multiple things into a bill as long as the caption, the top of the bill, reflects what's in the bill. Now, the first part of this bill would deal with the STAR, the State of Texas Assessment of Academic Readiness, or what we call the STAR, STAAR. And it would say that there would have to be developed another alternative assessment method for certain students with disabilities. And now, again, would not be instantaneous. This would be a process that would have to play out over a couple of school years. The other part of the bill would change state accountability for a particular special education setting. They're known as self-contained campuses. Now, in special education, as you probably know, we have this concept of least restrictive environment, or LRE, where students with disabilities should be educated to the maximum extent possible with students without disabilities. That would be considered the least restrictive environment. We would call that like mainstreaming or inclusion, in that instance, a full LRE. However, we recognize that certain students are not able to be served in that inclusive environment, and it is permissible under law, as long as certain procedures are followed, to put them in more separate settings. And one of the most extreme separate settings is a building, a campus separate for those students with disabilities, where only students with disabilities attend. This bill, House Bill 579, in addition to making changes to STAR, would change how the state monitors and holds that special ed campus accountable in our state accountability system. Next slide, please. Now, House Bill 655 is a high-level discipline and safety bill that talks about removal procedures for students who engage in what the bill refers to, and I put this in quotes, habitually violent behavior. And you're going to have to go read the bill to determine what does that mean. But for students who engage in habitually violent behavior, and they happen to be a student with a disability, this bill 655 makes a specific requirement that the ARD committee, or again, the Section 504 committee, have a meeting to think about the threat that that student with a disability poses to school safety, and charges the ARD committee or the 504 committee to make a decision about educational placement. We were just talking about least restrictive environment a second ago with the other bill. This also affects LRE, least restrictive environment, because House Bill 655 mandates that for these particular students, there be a review of the LRE placement for the student. So that's of interest to special educators and advocates. The next slide, please, is House Bill 772. And this bill has to do with corporal punishment. And the connection to special education here is, while this would be a very general ban, the bill also makes a change in chapter 29, where there are special education provisions, and makes a change in the state's prohibition of aversive techniques to incorporate the ban on corporal punishment, and would add corporal punishment as a prohibited aversive practice for students with disabilities. Okay, I mentioned that I had almost 30 bills to go through this session so far, and I'm almost at, I still have more House bills to go and some Senate bills to go, but we are going to be finishing on time, I promise, and we'll leave a bit of time at the end for questions. House Bill, let's see, where am I now? House Bill 772, looks like the bill that I'm talking about next. Nope, I think we just did that one. Next slide, please. House Bill 773 is what's referred to as the pickup bill. And by pickup, we mean the practice at schools where a school will call the parent during the school day and say, essentially, come pick up your student with a disability. And this bill would prohibit schools from unilaterally deciding a student doesn't belong at school for the rest of the day. And another term used for this practice is shadow discipline, where the student is effectively kicked out of school for the day, but it's not documented as a removal because the parent supposedly came and removed the student on their own. But that only happened because the school called mom and said, come get your child. So this would be a prohibition of that practice of calling parents without any regard or basis in saying, come pick up your child. Next slide, please. Several bills on this slide, but this one will go fairly quickly because House Bill 949 and 950 are both connected to students with dyslexia. And they make revisions to the special ed process with regard to students with dyslexia. I'll just note that I'm not sure why they're not just one bill, but one deals more with like kind of checking to see if a student might have dyslexia. We call that dyslexia screening. And the other bill gets a little bit more into the substance of delivery of dyslexia services. House Bill 1052 is next, and this goes to special education funding. I had mentioned that the Special Education Funding Commission was dedicated to this topic of changing the way the state finances special ed services in public schools. This is an example of a bill already filed that would make changes in the way that the state sends state dollars to school districts to pay for special ed services. Right now, the kind of basis of that is what is the school district's average daily attendance of special ed students? This bill would change it to just simply saying, well, what is your average enrollment in special ed? Whether the student is physically present or not. The theory is you have to have on staff, a school psychologist, you have to have on staff special ed teachers, special ed aides. So whether the student is there that particular day, you've got a plan for them to be there. And so the basis of funding would be changed from attendance to enrollment under House Bill 1052. Next bill, please. House Bill, next slide, please. Yes, House Bill 1066, again, is sort of a discipline bill, and it has to do with psychological assessments of certain students who pose a homicidal risk. And again, you'll have to go take a look at the bill to understand what is the psychological assessment of homicidal risk. But the bottom line is that students who sort of come out of that review with that risk documented by a psychologist, the school would have more discretion about whether or not the student can even be allowed to come back to school. And so that's of interest in terms of students with disabilities who might be disproportionately affected by that legislation. House Bill 1238 is another bill kind of connected to funding of special ed services. There is another state program that is called SHARS, SHARS for short, and that stands for School Health and Related Services. This is an interesting program because it's actually run out of the Health and Human Services Commission, but it funnels money to school districts to pay for certain services received by students with disabilities. This bill would create a state advisory committee on the SHARS program and, among other things, mandate special education representation on that new advisory committee if it were to be enacted. Next slide. Okay, this is my last House bill, then I'll be transitioning to a very short list of Senate bills. House Bill 1288 has to do with early childhood intervention, or ECI, services for infants and toddlers with developmental delays. And this bill would actually change the insurance code and make changes there about mandatory coverage of certain ECI services. So this would affect the transition of infants and toddlers under ECI to school districts and their early childhood special ed programs. Okay, now let me shift gears to the Senate. Again, we see that there are a lot more bills filed in the House, and so clearly a lot more special ed bills filed in the House. The Senate, there's much less level of legislative activity so far in terms of filed bills. And so my list of Senate bills is very short. The first one is Senate Bill 176. This is a tax credit account that would pertain to getting parents money to pay for private school tuition, other private educational services. In this bill, there is a reference to children with disabilities, and it said that they would be among the children to receive participation in these tax credit funded accounts. Senate Bill 245 is another example of a broad school discipline, school safety bill that has implications for students with disabilities. Again, this bill makes changes, among other things, to the threat assessment process I explained earlier. In this change, however, there would be a new requirement that the threat assessment team report the student to the Texas Department of Public Safety if that student was deemed to be a risk or a threat to the school. Next bill, Senate Bill 263 is another finance bill. This is a broad bill making many changes to the state school finance system, but among other things, there would be a tweak to the special ed allocation formula, similar concept as explained in the House bill that's connected to this idea of changing from a daily attendance basis to a special ed enrollment basis for state aid to school districts. Senate Bill 392 is an interesting bill in that it deals with the expenditures by school districts on legal fees. And it is a broad bill about how school districts may or may not spend money on legal fees and adding more transparency to those expenditures. And one of the enumerated expenses in this legislation is connected to special education legal disputes. And so to clarify, the bill would dictate special procedures before a school district could spend money on legal fees for special ed disputes. It wouldn't prohibit them, but it just would put some guidelines around how school districts spend money on legal fees for special ed disputes. The next bill is actually not on this list. So let me make mention of a bill. As I go through all of these bills, there was one bill I overlooked. I'm going to mention it now because of the order of bills that where we are. Senate Bill 418. Again, this is not in the slide deck, but Senate Bill 418 is a bill by Senator Paxton in the Senate. The bill would make changes to district transfer policy and would give priorities to special ed students to transfer to a new school district. Senate Bill 418 was a bill I overlooked, but it does make reference to students with disabilities getting priority in district transfers, moving from one district to another district. Senate Bill 445, which is now what we're picking up on this slide, and this is my last slide of bills, is about a grant program that would be paid for by the state, but administered at the local level, where participating parents, depending on how the district set up their selection process, would get a grant from the school district to help them buy out-of-school supplemental services for their child with a disability. Finally, Senate Bill 448 would create a special education liaison position in school districts, or mandate that there be such a position. Again, a special education liaison would be required in every school district. And this bill dictates what the responsibilities are of that special education liaison, such as representing the school district at the art committee, conducting a manifestation determination review when those reviews are necessary, and serving as the district's expert on IEPs. So that's sort of a unique bill about kind of restructuring from a staffing level, how special ed services would be delivered and managed at a school district level. Senate Bill 448. Well, I know I kind of talked a little bit fast, but there were a lot of bills to cover already, and we're only a week into this legislative session, the 88th legislature. Let me stop there and return the program to Stephanie to see if we have time for some questions. In the meantime, for those of you who get access to the PowerPoint, I do have a final slide, which has some references as well and resources. Stephanie.
All right. Just a reminder, if you have a question for us and you're joining us on Zoom today, please put your questions in the Q&A box. If you're joining us on Facebook, you can put it in the comments. We do have a number of questions. And so a couple of ones, House Bill 557, and then the Senate Bill 176. Are those both voucher programs? Is that how they're looking to do those? As vouchers?
Sure. So let me address House Bill 557. I guess you could call it a voucher bill. It's basically allowing parents to submit for certain school costs. So as the name suggests, parents would have to spend the money first and they get reimbursed. So it's not like a direct voucher where you're being given the money up front. So, but it has the elements of a voucher program. Yes.
All right. And the Senate Bill 176, same thing for that?
Let me just flip Senate Bill. Yes, essentially it would be a voucher bill. You could say the same thing. The way all of these are structured, you know, are somewhat unique, but essentially it would be a voucher program. Because this one does specifically talk about, Senate Bill 176 does specifically talk about private school tuition.
All right. And then a question about the House Bill 579. Is that meant to replace the current House Bill 4545 for assessments, or are they're just separate?
So House Bill 579, as again, was a two-per bill, as I mentioned. It has to do with state accountability for segregated campuses, but also makes changes in the STAR system and requires that, would allow a school district to set up an alternative assessment. So my understanding of the bill is that we would still have STAR, we would still have STAR Alt 2, but there would be now a third option for testing students with disabilities in terms of state testing.
Trying to get through here. Let's see what else we have. So many questions. I'm going to try to get as many of them as I can. Somebody's asking where to find literature on Senate Bill 392. I believe that was shared. Chelsea probably has that information.
Just as a general comment, again, if you go to Texas Legislature online, and the link was put in the chat, I believe it was put in again, you can see all the details of this legislation. And obviously, in the interest of time, I'm only providing a very high level summary of the bill. If there's a bill that caught your attention, I would strongly encourage you to go look at it. And again, just remember, just because you're reading the introduced version doesn't mean that's the way the bill is going to end up in the end if it moves forward. These bills always evolve, so you have to be mindful of which version you're looking at. But right now, sort of the nice thing about doing the program today is that we only have introduced versions of bills because we're only 1 week into the 88th legislature and absolutely nothing has happened in terms of legislative action.
Absolutely. So let's do one final question and then we're going to wrap up in the interest of time. So that last bill that talks about having a special education liaison, is that intent to give more voice to parents in our meetings?
This is an interesting question about Senate Bill 448, because when I saw that word liaison, I thought, yeah, typically liaison is someone who kind of works with both sides or maybe favors consumers or helps consumers, or in this instance, parents. But if you start reading the bill, it's actually more about administrative duties for school districts and special ed. And that liaison is charged with conducting those administrative duties. So it's not, I don't want to say it's not parent friendly, but it's not really, it's more on the district side than the parent side.
Excellent. All right. We're going to wrap up questions. Stephen, any final thoughts as we're wrapping up?
No, as I tried to point out at the beginning with the recap from last session and from the list you can already see from today even, there's a lot of activity that's very possible about special ed and students with disabilities. And all I can do is encourage you to, of course, as all of us as citizens, take an interest in what's happening at the Capitol, try to participate the best you can, and use the resources that we have provided you to stay on track. And I think there'll be a bit of an announcement here about how we're going to try to regroup in June to talk about what did happen.
Absolutely. Just want to thank you again so much for joining us and sharing all of this information. Let me come back over here and let's wrap up with some final announcements. Again, thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you all for attending our webinar today. We did record the webinar, and so a recording of our webinar will be available on our website at prntexas.org and also on our Facebook page. As a reminder, if you're needing a certificate of attendance, you will be receiving an email to thank you for attending today's webinar. If you'll follow the link in the email, you can get your certificate of attendance. We do have some upcoming webinars coming up soon. We've got executive function and accommodations for dyslexia. That's on February 21st at 12:15. And then as Stephen mentioned, we are going to review the special education issues before the 88th Texas Legislature when the session wraps. So on June 13th, make a plan to join us at 12:15, and Stephen is going to come back and review everything that took place in this legislative session. We also have some other webinars that will be coming up this spring. Other topics include navigating the contentious ARD meeting, high expectations and presuming competence, and our person-centered practice. You can check out our website for the dates and registration information for those topics as well. On the screen is the contact information for our Director of Statewide Services, Christina, our support specialist, Chelsea, and myself. Please check out our website at prntexas.org for information on our upcoming webinars, recordings of past webinars and upcoming events in your local region, as well as a lot of information for you as parents. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter and like us as well to keep up with more information. Thank you one last time for joining us. And Stephen, thank you. It's always a pleasure to have you come and share all of your wealth of information with us. We really appreciate it. Hope you all have a wonderful day and come back and join us again for our next webinar.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Stephen. We appreciate it.
Yes, no worries. Well, let me know if you need anything, and then otherwise we will regroup in May or whenever as we get right closer to our June webinar.
Absolutely. We'll definitely be in touch and we'll be ready and expecting to hear what all happened in June. So thank you and have a wonderful legislative season.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.